It's time again for the Insiders with Chuck Qualla and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.
Hi, I'm Chuck Qualla, former Senate Majority Leader.
And I'm Scott Jensen, former Assembly Speaker.
Well, Scott, you must have some memories of a colleague of ours who passed away, Dave Prosser, who was both in the Assembly, Speaker, and also Supreme Court Justice. What are your memories and your thoughts?
Oh, wonderful man. This is a guy who really devoted his life to serving others. I saw a newspaper story that said he was married to his job, and he had a lot of great jobs. David was a U.S. Department of Justice aide. He was a congressional aide. He was district attorney in Wisconsin. He was the first Republican speaker after a 24-year spell of Democratic control. He led us out of the wilderness and back into power after 24 years. He was a tax commissioner. He was a Supreme Court justice for, I think, 18 years. He was just a wonderful man. He was clever and he was kind to all sorts of people of every stripe. And there were times when he came to me when I was majority leader, and he would have just spent 2 hours with some staffer, and that was the most important thing to him. Is this person had a problem, David was going to try to figure out a way to solve it. He was just incredibly kind. He was also very clever. You'll recall back when there was a big debate in Wisconsin about whether or not people were migrating to Wisconsin for welfare benefits. And lots of people debated whether or not that was true. And David Prosser just sort of broke open that entire debate with a clever thought, says from a former district attorney. He went down to Chicago and took pictures of people getting on buses in Chicago, then went and chased the bus to Wisconsin, where it got to Milwaukee. People got off the bus. He followed them to the welfare office where they picked up their checks, and then they got back on the bus. And so while there had been this debate about how many people might be doing this, the picture of someone getting on a bus in Chicago and coming out, or video of someone getting on a bus in Chicago and going and picking up a welfare check in Wisconsin ended that debate, I think, in the state pretty effectively. We would not have had a Republican majority in the state assembly. Lots of people had tried it. Tommy Thompson gave it his all, right? He couldn't get it done, but it was David Prosser who got us to the majority in the state assembly. And but for one term, we've had it ever since then. He was just clever about all sorts of things. He wrote a jingle for John Gard's campaign for the state assembly that I can't sing, but I could still recite to you today. It was so clever. It was so catchy. And it's part of the reason that John Gard got in the legislature in the first place, let alone became speaker at a later time. In another race, he wrote a country tune to help the candidate get across the finish line in the Eau Claire, Chippewa Falls area. This guy was an intellectual who loved nothing more than the cartoon theatrics of all-star wrestling. He loved those Saturday morning professional wrestling shows. He would talk about them, and I'd be looking at him going, this is the same guy who's studying law and understanding all the principles that are there. And then he gets his kicks out of watching World Wrestling Federation. So he was one of a kind, and there's a whole generation of people who served in the state assembly for whom he was a mentor and a kind soul.
Well, I think obviously Scott knows a lot more about Dave Prosser than I do. However, I do remember having lunch with Dave, and it was a good conversation. I think it's important that you be able to reach across the aisle. And I think maybe perhaps having been in leadership, both of us, it was a good time after we had both done that. It was a good time to talk, and it was a good conversation. And I think Scott also touched on something else. For people that are lawyers and then in the judiciary, I was a lawyer, but in the legislature, and then also having the judicial part or the legislative part. It's an interesting combination, as Scott kind of points out. There's all of the legal stuff, which David was aware of. I mean, he was a Supreme Court justice at the end of the day as well, and DA, et cetera. there's all of that. But then when you get into the legislature, there's the law. There's all of the theatrics, as Scott points out, that David was involved in. We all have to be involved in. I learned when I got into the legislature, I just wanted to be a policy wonk. Once I got in, I realized, no, the question is who gets elected. That determines whether or not these things are going to be successful or not. And I think Dave had a real knack for that. And it was interesting that he was able to span the law, the legislature, and then the judiciary. And even though the judiciary is the law, it's a very different component. So he had a wide and varied life. He valued his privacy, and I think that he deserves that. And I think that David Prosser is an interesting character that Wisconsin, maybe only Wisconsin could produce, and maybe only Appleton can produce.
He's one of a kind. We were very lucky to have him.
We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to The Insiders with Chuck Walla and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.